It was a Friday night in October, the kind of night when the air smelled of fallen leaves and gasoline from passing cars. My children were asleep upstairs, Matthew curled under his Superman blanket, Rebecca clutching her stuffed rabbit. Linda had just brewed coffee, and the radio hummed softly in the kitchen. Life was ordinary, almost boring, and that was the beauty of it. I was tired from fixing transmissions all day, grease still stubborn under my fingernails, but happy. Then came the pounding. 3 violent knocks that shook the front door so hard, the picture frames rattled on the wall. My heart jolted, like someone had reached inside and squeezed it. Linda froze, her hand halfway to her coffee cup. "Who's knocking like that at this hour?" she whispered. Before I could answer, the red and blue glow of police lights bled through the curtains, painting our living room in flashing chaos. I opened the door, and there stood Detective Charles Hargrove, with 2 officers behind him. His face was stone, his jaw set as if he had already decided who I was. "David Miller," he barked. "You're under arrest for the murder of Anthony Walters." My ears rang. Murder? Walters? I barely knew the man. "There must be some mistake," I stammered, but cold steel handcuffs bit into my wrists before I could even reach for Linda's hand. My children's sleepy voices echoed from upstairs. "Daddy?" as 2 uniforms dragged me down the porch steps. The October wind cut through my shirt, and the scent of burning leaves from a neighbor's yard mixed with the stench of gasoline from the idling squad car. That was the moment my life snapped in two. The ordinary shattered into something unrecognizable. The neighbors had gathered on their porches, shadows against the flickering street lamps. Evelyn, Linda's sister, was there too, her sharp eyes glinting like she had been waiting for this moment. She whispered something into Linda's ear, and I saw my wife's shoulders collapse under invisible weight. "You can't do this," I shouted at Hargrove as they shoved me into the back of the squad car. My voice cracked, my throat raw, but the detective only smirked like a man watching a card trick he already knew the ending to. "Tell it to the judge," he muttered, slamming the door. The air inside the cruiser was thick with stale cigarettes, the vinyl seat sticky under my palms. I twisted against the cuffs until my wrists burned, but it was useless. Outside, Linda stood clutching Rebecca, Matthew clinging to her leg, their small faces streaked with tears. The sight of them blurred behind the glass as the car pulled away. My chest hollowed out and a single thought screamed inside me, "They'll never believe me." The siren wailed, and the world outside became a smear of streetlights and darkness. My heart pounded against my ribs like it wanted to escape, but there was nowhere left to run. My name, my life, my family, it was already slipping from me, stolen by a crime I didn't commit. At the station, the walls smelled of disinfectant and sweat. They shoved me into a chair under a buzzing fluorescent light that made my eyes ache. Papers slapped onto the table, statements, photographs, fingerprints that weren't mine but somehow were. Detective Hargrove leaned in, his breath sour with coffee, his eyes cold. "We got you, Miller. Witnesses place you near the scene. Your prints are on the weapon. Don't play dumb." My chest burned with rage. "I was home with my family." "You know this isn't true." But my words ricocheted off the cinder block walls, useless, forgotten before they even landed. Hours blurred into the metallic click of typewriters, the slam of doors, the scratching of pens. By dawn I was shoved into a holding cell, the stench of urine and despair clinging to the air. I pressed my forehead against the cold iron bars, my mind replaying Linda's face, my children's cries. I had walked out my front door a father, a husband, an honest man. And now, before the sun even rose, I was a murderer in their eyes. The gavel hadn't even fallen, but I could already feel the weight of prison walls closing in. And somewhere deep down, in that nauseating silence between my heartbeats, I knew this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would not end soon. Before my name was chained to headlines and court files, I was just a man who loved engines, music on the radio, and Sunday dinners with my family. I can still smell the grease on my hands, the oil that soaked into my skin no matter how hard I scrubbed with soap and a wire brush. My shop on the corner of Maple Street was my second home. I'd roll up the doors at dawn, let the autumn air rush in, and spend the day under hoods of Chevys and Fords, my knuckles raw, my back stiff, but my heart full. Linda used to bring Matthew and Rebecca by after school. I can still see Matthew climbing into the driver's seat of a Mustang, pretending to steer, his little voice shouting, "Dad, let's race." Rebecca would hand me tools with her small fingers, giggling when I smeared grease on her nose. Those were the years when everything seemed possible, when my biggest worry was whether a customer would pay me on time. We didn't have much, but what we had was ours. My house smelled of Linda's pot roast. My evenings were filled with laughter, and my dreams were simple. Keep my shop running, raise my children right, and grow old with the woman I loved. I had no idea how fragile it all was, how fast life can flip from warmth to ice. On Friday nights, after closing the shop, I'd sit on the porch with Linda. She'd sip sweet tea, and I'd sip beer, the sound of cicadas filling the Ohio summer air. We'd talk about nothing and everything, the kids' grades, the leaky faucet, maybe even a vacation we couldn't quite afford. I didn't need trips or riches. My world was already perfect in its smallness. Matthew's laugh when he caught a baseball. Rebecca falling asleep with her thumb in her mouth, clutching that stuffed rabbit so tight it looked like it could burst. Linda humming while folding laundry, her voice softer than the radio. These moments were my riches, even if the bank account said otherwise. I didn't chase power, I didn't crave glory. I just wanted to be known as a good father, a good husband, an honest mechanic who kept his word. But I learned too late that sometimes being honest, being simple, being decent isn't enough. Sometimes the world chooses you as its scapegoat, and everything you built with calloused hands and a faithful heart can be stolen overnight. I think back now, in the silence of those prison nights, to the man I was then. I see him sitting on that porch smelling of motor oil and hope, believing the world was fair if you worked hard enough. That man is a ghost now, someone I can't reach no matter how far I stretch my hands through the dark. I grieve him more than I grieved my freedom, because he was the best of me. The man who kissed his children's foreheads before bed, who whispered promises to Linda that he'd never let anything hurt her. The man who thought love and effort could shield a family from storms. I miss him. I miss myself. And the cruelest part? When the handcuffs clicked shut that October night, it wasn't just my body they took. They stole the man I used to be, piece by piece, until all that was left was a number on a prison jumpsuit. And still, as I sat in that cell remembering the life I lost, I didn't know the storm had only just begun. They said I killed a man behind the Riverside Diner, in the alley where the dumpsters reeked of day-old grease and coffee grounds. Anthony Walters, 37, a line cook with a temper and a gambling habit. I knew him the way you know everyone in a small town. Nods at the gas station, a few quick fixes on his rusty Chevy when it coughed smoke, an occasional thanks man, paid in crumpled singles. That was all. On the night he died, I was home tightening the loose hinge on Matthew's bedroom door, while Linda read Rebecca a story about a rabbit in a red scarf. I remember the sound of the tiny screws in the butter dish, the smell of pine sol from Linda's evening mop, the way the floorboards creaked under my knees, ordinary, warm, safe, but Detective Charles Hargrove didn't want ordinary. He wanted a story that snapped into place like a puzzle he already owned. Motive, he said later, tossing a file onto the metal table. Debt. There's talk Walters owed you for work. Talk, not proof. Then came the wrench, a 12-inch Craftsman, tossed in a clear evidence bag smeared with something dark. Your prints, Hargrove said, almost smiling. My stomach dropped. Sure, my prints would be on a wrench. My shop was full of them, but that wasn't my wrench. The etching on the handle was wrong, the wear not mine. Still, the photos stared back like gospel. And then Hargrove slid a single Polaroid across the table, me outside the Riverside 2 nights earlier, handing Walters his keys. A handshake, a thank you, a quick laugh. Looks cozy, he said. Cozy. It was a handshake in a town where everybody shook hands. I opened my mouth to explain, but the room answered for me. The fluorescent buzz, the scrape of his chair, the click of the door. And in that stale air, I felt the story sealing shut without me. Prosecutor Alan Whitford breathed theatre into the case. He stood in front of a storyboard of my life and drew red arrows like a weatherman calling a storm. Fight over money. An angry mechanic. A body behind a diner. You connect the dots, he told the grand jury, voice smooth as a salesman's. The dots, I learned, were rubber bands. They snapped where he wanted them. The motive grew legs when Evelyn Carter, Linda's sister, told investigators I'd complained about being stiffed by certain customers. She wasn't lying, I'd grumbled. Any working man would. But Whitford repeated her words until they sounded like threats. The timeline was a noose. A neighbor claimed he saw my pickup near the riverside around 10:30 p.m. My truck? Half the town had a maroon Silverado. Mine just happened to be the villain of the week. They showed the jury a blurry photo from a traffic cam, 2 headlights and a smear of color. Distinctive, Whitford said. Distinctive looked exactly like every truck on State Route 14. Then came the clincher, the bottle. Detectives said a beer bottle near the dumpster had my fingerprints. I don't drink beer, I've said it till my voice bled. Months later, I'd remember the night Thomas Reed, a guard who would one day enjoy twisting the knife, told me in the yard, "Funny thing about bottles. Go missing from evidence rooms like socks from dryers." Back then I only had disbelief. If the world was a scale, my word weighed less than dust. I watched Whitford polish his story, watched Judge Henry Cartwright nod like a metronome set to guilty, and realized I wasn't standing in a court of law. I was trapped in a play where the ending was printed on the tickets. When the grand jury returned the indictment, the hallway smelled of coffee and fear. Linda squeezed my hand so hard our bones clicked. "Tell them," she whispered. I did. The walls just listened and learned nothing. They called it an investigation. I called it a harvest. They raked my life for anything that could be sharpened into a blade. A customer named Vince Turner said I once cursed about Anthony being late with payment, a muttered annoyance swollen into a death wish. A busboy, Julio Ramirez, swore he saw me arguing with Walters a week earlier. I remembered the moment clearly. Walters joked about paying in beer. I joked about charging extra for jokes. Laughter. 2 men leaning on a fender under the neon diner sign, tired and hungry. The kind of moment that evaporates unless someone needs a storm. And someone needed a storm. When I asked for the diner's back entrance camera footage, the one that would show every step to that dumpster, Hargrove told my attorney, a nervous public defender named Peter Lang, that the camera was malfunctioning. On the exact night a man was beaten to death. Lang's voice shook when he repeated it to me across the scratched glass of the jail visiting booth. I touched the handset cold as a tombstone. "Find the repair logs," I told him. "Find the technician. Find anything that turns that malfunction into a lie." He nodded, lips pale. Days stretched. Nights bled. I pressed my ear to silence and heard only the rhythm of doors. Then came a whisper in the holding tank from a man named Curtis Tate, a drifter with eyes like winter. "Walters owed money to a man who doesn't send reminders," he said. "Name starts with D." Curtis smiled without teeth. "Maybe look where the lights don't reach," I told Lang. He scribbled, promised, vanished into the thinning air of all my promises. The preliminary hearing arrived wearing a suit stitched with certainty. The judge allowed the bottle. He allowed the wrench. He allowed the neighbor's headlights and Evelyn's sharpened concern. He did not allow my alibi. Linda's testimony was spousal bias, and Matthew and Rebecca were too young to be reliable. I stood there shaking, tasting copper. Somewhere in the back row, Evelyn folded her arms and wouldn't look at me. When the gavel fell and they set my trial date, I felt the floor tilt. I reached for the rail to steady myself and saw Detective Hargrove watching me with a look I would not understand for years. It wasn't triumph. It was fear disguised as victory. And that, God help me, was the last clean breath I took before the machine swallowed me whole. The courthouse smelled of polish and old paper, the kind of air that carried every lie ever spoken beneath its roof. When I stepped inside in shackles, the wood-paneled walls loomed over me like coffins standing upright. Judge Henry Cartwright presided from his bench, his face a marble mask, eyes as cold as stone. The jury filed in, 12 strangers clutching notebooks, avoiding my gaze as if looking at me would contaminate them. Linda sat in the gallery, Rebecca perched on her lap, Matthew beside her, restless in his small suit. Their eyes met mine for just a second, and I saw hope there, fragile as glass. My attorney, Peter Lang, leaned toward me, his tie crooked, sweat already staining his collar. "We'll fight," he whispered, though his voice cracked like a boy's. Then Prosecutor Alan Whitford stood, his polished shoes clicking like a metronome of doom. He spoke of rage, of money, of betrayal. He spun my life into a narrative sharp enough to cut through reason. With every sentence, he painted me not as David Miller the mechanic, the father, the husband, but as a shadowy monster who killed over pocket change. The jury nodded, murmured, scribbled. And I sat there, tasting iron in my mouth, as if I'd bitten down on a nail. From the first gavel strike, I knew this wasn't a trial. This was theatre, and I was the villain in their play. Whitford's witnesses paraded across the stand like actors reciting lines. Vince Turner, the customer who once owed me $20, testified I looked dangerous when I reminded Walters to pay. His words, delivered with trembling lips, landed heavier than any truth I could muster. Julio Ramirez, the busboy, swore under oath that he saw me raise my voice at Walters. He didn't mention the laughter afterward, didn't mention the handshake, just the raised voice. Evelyn Carter, Linda's sister, delivered the final blow. She clasped her pearl necklace with trembling hands, her voice quivering as she said, "David had a temper." I worried for Linda's safety. Gasps echoed through the gallery. My wife lowered her face into her hands, shoulders trembling. I wanted to stand, to shout that Evelyn had hated me from the start, that she had wanted Linda to marry someone with ambition, not a man covered in grease. But Lang tugged my sleeve. "Stay quiet," he hissed. His strategy was silence. Silence while my life unraveled thread by thread. The wrench gleamed in its evidence bag like a relic, the beer bottle's smudged glass reflecting courtroom light, as if mocking me. Whitford held them up, his voice rich with certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not speculation. This is fact. This man's hands are soaked in blood." I gripped the table until my knuckles whitened. The truth was slipping, dissolving under the weight of a story more convincing than reality. When my turn came, Lang called me to the stand. My voice trembled at first, but then I poured it all out. Where I was, what I did, the sound of Linda reading to Rebecca, the screws in the butter dish. I described the warmth of home that night, the impossibility of me in that alley. But as I spoke, I watched the jurors' eyes glaze over. Their pens stopped moving. To them, I was just a desperate man clawing at innocence with words too ordinary to compete with Whitford's theatrics. Judge Cartwright interrupted twice, sustaining objections before I could finish sentences. Lang fumbled, shuffled papers, muttered apologies. So I felt abandoned even in the chair meant to defend me. Closing arguments sealed the coffin. Whitford paced, his voice low, confident. "The evidence is clear. The motive undeniable. The witnesses consistent. Do not let sympathy cloud justice. Sympathy. That's what my life had become. An inconvenience for them to brush aside in the name of justice." When the jury filed out, Linda finally raised her eyes to me. They brimmed with tears, but behind them was something worse than sorrow. Doubt. I felt it pierce me deeper than any verdict could. Hours later, when the jury returned, the foreman's voice echoed across the room. "Guilty of second-degree murder." The gavel fell like a hammer on my chest. 32 years. That was the price they set for a crime I did not commit. And as the deputies led me away, the last thing I saw was Matthew burying his face into Linda's shoulder, Rebecca clutching her rabbit tight. My children watched their father become a number, and my heart cracked into pieces too jagged to ever fit back together. The first thing I remember about prison wasn't the bars or the walls. It was the smell. A stench of bleach fighting with sweat, piss, and despair. A cocktail that burned your nostrils until you stopped noticing. They stripped me of my clothes, of my name, of every trace of home. My wedding band was taken, my fingerprints inked again, and the number 28741 was stamped on my jumpsuit. David Miller no longer existed. I shuffled down a corridor where fluorescent lights hummed and echoed like flies in a jar. The gates clanged behind me, one then another, each sound hammering shut a piece of my soul. Inside the cell, the walls sweated with moisture, the mattress sagged like rotten bread, and the toilet in the corner stank of rust and shame. My cellmate, Frank Donovan, was a barrel of muscle with a scar running from his ear to his collarbone. He looked at me once, snorted, and went back to doing push-ups on the cracked floor. I sat on the edge of my bunk, my hands trembling, the cries of men echoing down the tier like wolves howling at a bloody moon. That first night I closed my eyes and prayed, not for freedom, not for justice, but simply to survive until morning. Days bled into each other like ink on wet paper. The routine was merciless. Count at dawn, count at noon, count at dusk. Cold oatmeal for breakfast, mystery meat for dinner, fights for dessert. Thomas Reed, a guard with dead eyes, made sure I learned quickly. He'd slam me against the wall during shakedowns, whisper in my ear, "Murderer," like it was my real name. The other inmates circled me, testing, waiting to see if I'd break. Some offered smirks, others threats. I learned to keep my head down, to move fast, to never leave my back exposed. Frank Donovan, my cellmate, became both shield and teacher. "Don't talk too much," he grunted one night, rolling a cigarette from scraps. "Don't look too long. And if someone swings, swing back harder. Respect's the only currency in here." His voice was gravel, but his advice was gold. Slowly I learned to walk the yard like I belonged, though inside I was screaming. I missed Linda's touch, Rebecca's giggles, Matthew's questions about cars. Instead I had concrete barbed wire and the constant echo of slamming doors. Survival wasn't about muscles or fists. It was about killing the part of yourself that longed for softness. The nights were the worst. The darkness was never complete. A yellow bulb hummed outside the cell, throwing shadows that stretched like ghosts across the walls. Men screamed in their sleep, nightmares, regrets, sometimes just madness clawing out of their throats. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of my arrest, every word at trial, trying to find the missing thread that could have saved me. I counted cracks in the ceiling until numbers blurred. I whispered my children's names, hoping somehow they could hear me across the miles of razor wire. And when despair crawled too deep into my chest, I found myself listening to Frank. He'd tell stories of his daughter, of fishing trips long gone, his voice soft like a lullaby drowned in smoke. Sometimes he'd go quiet, and in that silence I felt less alone. But hope was dangerous in there. Hope could get you killed. I learned to bury it deep under layers of stone, where no guard or inmate could sniff it out. Still, every so often in the dead of night, I'd close my eyes and see Linda's face, Rebecca's rabbit, Matthew's blanket. And for a heartbeat I was free, until the clang of the morning count ripped me back into the cage. It was a letter that gutted me first. I still remember the guard sliding it through the bars like he was tossing trash. The paper was thin, the envelope smudged with rain, but the handwriting on the front made my chest collapse. Linda's. I tore it open with shaking hands, hungry for her words, starving for a piece of home. "David," it began. "I don't know how to say this." My eyes devoured the lines until they blurred. Her visits had slowed. Her letters had grown shorter, but I still believed we were unbreakable. Then came the knife. The children need stability. I can't keep raising them in the shadow of a prison. I've met someone. "I'm sorry." My throat closed. I read the lines again and again, praying the words would change. They didn't. The wall spun. Frank found me hours later, the letter crushed in my fist. He didn't say a word, just sat there, the silence between us heavier than iron. That night I dreamed of Rebecca calling me Daddy one last time, Matthew's hand slipping from mine. I woke choking on grief so raw it tasted like blood. Linda hadn't just left me. She had buried me alive. Months later, another blow landed. This time it was my mother. She had died of a stroke at her kitchen table, the same place where she once placed birthday cakes, with crooked candles in front of me. The chaplain, Reverend Samuel Green, was the one who told me. He stood outside my cell, his Bible pressed against his chest. "I'm sorry, son," he said softly. His words should have comforted me, but they cracked something deeper. My request to attend the funeral was denied. Security risk, they called it. Instead, they gave me 10 minutes in a chapel with a priest I didn't know, and a candle that sputtered as if even the flame couldn't bear the weight of my grief. I pressed my palms together, whispering prayers that sounded like broken glass. I wanted to tell her I was still fighting, still holding on, but all I could do was stare at the candle until wax spilled like tears. That night the cell felt colder than ever. Frank tried to distract me with stories about his daughter, but I couldn't listen. My mother had left this world believing her son was a murderer. That truth carved itself into my bones. The final loss that sealed my heart came years later. Frank himself. One evening he didn't wake from his bunk. His chest had given out, years of hard living and prison air collapsing his body in silence. I shook him, called his name, but his skin was already cooling. The guards came indifferent, hauling him out like another piece of broken furniture. I stood in the empty cell, his cigarette tin still on the shelf, his voice still echoing in my ears. For 18 years Frank had been my anchor, the one soul who saw me as more than a number, and now he was gone, leaving me to the void. That night I sat on the floor staring at the cracks in the concrete, realizing I was utterly alone. The letters from Linda had stopped long ago. Matthew and Rebecca grew into strangers I never saw. My mother was in the ground, my father long before her, and now Frank, my last tether, was ashes in a prison furnace. Loss wasn't a wave anymore. It was the ocean, endless and crushing. And as I lay down on that cold bunk, the weight of it pressed so deep into me, I wondered if I'd ever find air again. Time in prison doesn't move forward. It circles. The seasons only came to me through small windows and the chatter of guards. Winter coats in December, sweat-stained shirts in July. But inside, every day felt the same. The clang of bars at dawn, the sour oatmeal, the shuffle to the yard where men walked in endless loops like ghosts chained to the dust. After Frank's death, silence became my only companion. I stopped writing letters. Who would I write to? Linda had built another life, one where I no longer existed. My children were grown, their faces blurring in my mind until I wasn't sure if I remembered them or just invented them. Birthdays passed without candles, without calls. My name was no longer spoken in their homes, forgotten, buried. At night I would whisper, Matthew, Rebecca, into the dark, hoping the walls might carry the sound beyond the razor wire. But the echoes died in the concrete, and with every echo that vanished, so did another piece of me. There was a library in the prison, dusty, small, half the books missing their covers. I lived there. I devoured pages like starving men devour bread. Steinbeck Baldwin, even manuals on engine repair I already knew by heart. The words were my escape, my rebellion. Guards would sneer, calling me professor, but I didn't care. Books were the only windows that hadn't been barred shut. Still, even in those pages, the truth bled through. The world outside was moving without me. New presidents, new wars, new music, all whispered in newspapers that passed from hand to hand until the ink blurred. I watched men leave on parole, their families waiting with balloons and tears. No one ever waited for me. I was a ghost in a cell block, my name barely a memory in the outside world. Forgotten birthdays turned into forgotten years. Forgotten years turned into decades. And I wondered, when your own family buries you in silence, do you still exist at all? There were times I thought about ending it. In the quiet after lockdown, with the lights buzzing like angry bees, I would stare at the sheet in my hands, thinking how easy it would be to twist it into a rope. The thought lingered like poison. But then I'd hear Reverend Green's footsteps in the tier, his voice low, steady, praying for men who had long abandoned prayer. He'd stop by my cell sometimes, place a Bible through the bars, whisper, "You're still seen, David. Seen." The word stung because it was a lie in most places. Yet some nights it kept me alive. Forgotten as I was, erased by my own blood, I clung to the faint belief that somewhere, somehow, truth had not died. But truth is patient, and patience is cruel. As the years stacked like bricks, I wondered if truth would find me before death did. And in that uncertainty, I walked the yard in circles day after day, a man half alive, half buried, waiting for a resurrection that might never come. The day she first walked into visiting with a folder under her arm, I thought the world had finally started to tilt back toward me. Sarah Coleman, young, sharp, eyes that cut through the fog. They told me later she was a public defender turned innocence project lawyer. In that fluorescent room where visiting booths smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, she sat opposite me like a sudden sunrise. "David Miller?" she asked, and there was no pity in her voice, only a precise curiosity that felt like a scalpel. I told her the story twice, 3 times, trying to fit years into minutes, the party at the riverside, the wrench that wasn't mine, the bottle, the camera that malfunctioned. She listened, pen hovering over a notepad, the ink catching little islands of light. When I finished, she slid the folder across the glass and said, "We found something." My mouth was dry. My heart did that small animal flip that felt like hope and fear at the same time. She opened the folder. A photocopy of evidence room, logs, a name circled in ballpoint, Officer Michael Jennings, and a maintenance receipt for the diner camera stamped 2 days after the murder. The receipt, signed by Romero Alvarez, a name I knew from the paper routes. "They said the camera was down," Sarah said, tapping the paper, "but here's the repairman's invoice showing footage was retrieved." The world narrowed. For 32 years, someone had said a camera malfunctioned. For 32 years, that lie had been a wall. The folder smelled faintly of copier, toner, and rain, but to me, it smelled like a door opening. Then she looked up and added quietly, "There's more, but I can't show it here." They moved fast after that. File requests, letters, a chain of small keys turning in rusty locks. The legal team Sarah built around me felt like strangers at first, then like an army. Daniel Harris, the reporter who later wrote the article, "That shook Town Hall," came down to the visits with a camera and a voice that asked the right questions. He dug where others had only swept dust. Together, Sarah and Daniel sifted through records like men panning for gold. They found memos with Detective Hargrove's initials, notes about clearing cases, and a string of payments that didn't make sense. Money transferred to shell accounts, checks cashed under phony names. The more we found, the more the neat architecture of my conviction looked like a house of cards propped up on lies. One night, Sarah brought me a transcript she'd secured from a retired evidence clerk. The clerk's hands had trembled when he spoke, but his words were steady. We were told to log items differently. Certain items were to be flagged as miscellaneous. No one would look twice. My fingers slid across the paper like they were touching a live wire. If the evidence had been hidden by people inside the system, if the bottle, the wrench, even witness statements were curated to point at me, then my conviction was less a mistake and more a manufactured verdict. For the first time in decades, anger and thirst for truth lit a fire that wasn't choking on smoke. Still, every document came with a silence, gaps, redactions, scribbled initials. Whoever had built the wall had left holes, but they were small and dangerous. I wanted to climb through, but every hole I pushed at felt watched. The breakthrough came in a hatbox of old files from the county clerk's basement, of all places, pulled out by an intern with aching knees and stubborn eyes. Inside was a crumpled maintenance log that contradicted the malfunction story. Timestamps showing footage archived the night of Walter's death, then a note in a different hand, removed for review. Beside it, a short handwritten note read, "Cleared by H. Hargrove." My hands shook so hard I could barely steady the page. The hatbox smelled like mildew and lost years, and I laughed out loud, a small, cracked sound that was equal parts joy and terror. Sarah looked at me like she'd seen a man come back from the dead. Daniel's email to his editor read, "Potential official misconduct. This will blow." They filed motions, subpoenas, demands that made the courthouse murmur. For the first time since those handcuffs clamped cold around my wrists, the machine that had broken me creaked and stuttered. But the older men in power do not bend easily. They bruise and they clutch. I could feel the room change the day the subpoena was served to Detective Hargrove. An electric hush fell over the town like a storm gathering. I had imagined fireworks, trumpet calls, a grand exposing. Instead, I felt a cold hand settling on my shoulder, as if the past were a living thing, and it whispered, "You should have stayed buried." Courtrooms smell different when you walk in after 32 years. The varnish on the benches, the faint perfume of jurors, the sterile coffee drifting from the clerk's desk. It all mixed into something surreal. I sat at the defense table again, but this time Sarah Coleman was beside me, her shoulders square, her binder thick with the bones of my stolen life. Across the aisle sat Prosecutor Alan Whitford, older now, hair grey, his once polished confidence dulled but not gone. He glanced at me like I was an old ghost crawling back to haunt him. When Sarah stood to speak, her voice sliced through the air. "Your Honor, we are here not for mercy, but for justice." Evidence was withheld, witnesses manipulated, records doctored. David Miller was convicted not by proof but by design. The judge this time was not Cartwright, he had long since retired, but Judge Evelyn Parker, a woman with a reputation for cutting through theatrics. She adjusted her glasses, leaned forward, and asked the question that had never been asked in my first trial. "Where is the missing camera footage?" The gallery buzzed like bees. For years they said it never existed. Now pages of maintenance logs told a different story. And when Judge Parker demanded the tape, silence hit the room like a thunderclap. The days that followed felt like a war fought in slow motion. Sarah called witnesses who had been silent for decades. The retired clerk confessed under oath, that evidence logs were altered at Detective Hargrove's command. Daniel Harris published front-page articles that made people stop in diners and gas stations, shaking their heads, whispering my name again. But this time with shame, not suspicion. Whitford tried to object, tried to paint Sarah as young and reckless, but the weight of paper was heavier than his voice. Exhibits stacked on the judge's bench, the maintenance receipt, the hatbox log, even sworn statements from technicians who said they were told to file away the diner footage. Every page felt like a brick torn out of the wall that had held me for 3 decades. Still, the state fought back. They dragged out old witnesses, trying to reinforce the story, but cracks showed. Julio Ramirez admitted under cross-examination that police pressured him, that he'd been threatened with deportation if he didn't comply. The jury gasped. I closed my eyes and whispered my children's names. For the first time, I could almost see the light seeping through the cracks. But light is fragile in a place built on shadows. Then came the day Sarah called Detective Charles Hargrove himself to the stand. The man looked smaller now, his once broad shoulders hunched, his voice scratchier, but his eyes still burned with defiance. "Detective," Sarah began, "can you explain why evidence logs bear your initials next to items marked miscellaneous?" He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat. "Clerical errors, nothing more." She pressed harder, page after page, until his face turned crimson. "And this note, cleared by H. Is this your handwriting?" Silence. He shifted in his seat, the weight of years pressing down. The room leaned forward as Judge Parker repeated the question. Finally, Hargrove muttered, "Yes." That single word cracked like a gunshot. Yes, it was his. Yes, he had touched the chain of evidence. Yes, the foundation of my conviction was rotten. The gallery erupted. Some shouted, others gasped. Reporters scribbled like mad. I sat there, my heart slamming against my ribs, my hands trembling on the table. For 32 years I had been screaming into silence, and in that moment the silence finally screamed back. Yet even then, as Hargrove stepped down, his eyes flicked toward me with something colder than guilt, something that whispered, "You may walk free, but you will never walk whole." The morning of my release, the prison corridors smelled the same, as they always had: bleach, rust, the faint sourness of men packed too close for too long. But that day those smells didn't feel like chains. They felt like ghosts clinging to me one last time. Officer Michael Jennings, the one guard who'd ever shown me kindness, walked me down the hall. His boots echoed steady on the concrete, mine dragged in disbelief. "You're a free man, Miller," he said quietly, almost as if the words themselves were fragile. I clutched the paper bag they'd given me, my old wallet, a broken wristwatch, 32 years of my life reduced to relics. When the gates rolled open, the clang was louder than thunder, a sound I'd imagined in dreams that always dissolved before I could step through. But this time I stepped. The air outside slapped me, cold and sharp, so different from the recycled prison air that had filled my lungs for decades. I blinked against the sunlight, my eyes watering like I'd stared into a torch. For a moment, I couldn't move. My legs felt like stone pillars, my body unsure if it belonged in this world anymore. And then I heard cameras clicking, reporters shouting my name, "David, David," like they had just discovered I was alive. Freedom, I learned, doesn't rush in like a wave. It trickles, hesitant, almost suspicious. They handed me clothes donated by strangers. A button-up shirt too loose at the collar, jeans stiff with starch. I felt like a mannequin dressed for someone else's life. Outside the gates, Daniel Harris waited with his notepad, his recorder. "How does it feel?" he asked, voice eager, eyes shining. "How does it feel?" I opened my mouth, but the words clogged in my throat. How do you describe breathing air that doesn't taste of metal? How do you explain that the sun feels like fire when you haven't felt it in decades? I managed to whisper, "Strange, just that, strange." A car pulled up then, a sedan with its paint chipped. Sarah Coleman stepped out, her smile firm but her eyes glistening. "It's over, David," she said, her voice steady. I wanted to believe her. My hands shook as I reached for the door handle, as if opening that car meant stepping into a life that wasn't mine anymore. I slid inside, the seatbelt rough against my chest. the dashboard blinking unfamiliar lights. As the prison shrank in the rearview mirror, I felt both lighter and heavier than ever before. The drive back into the city was like being reborn into a world that had kept moving without me. Billboards with brands I didn't know. Cars shaped like spaceships compared to the trucks I once fixed. People walking down sidewalks with glowing screens in their hands, their faces lit by a blue light I didn't recognize. I pressed my forehead to the window, dizzy, as though time itself was a tide I couldn't catch. Sarah tried to fill the silence, explaining the next steps, the press, the paperwork. I barely heard her. All I heard was the roar of traffic, the honking horns, the city alive in ways that felt both thrilling and terrifying. When we stopped at a red light, I saw a father holding his son's hand at the crosswalk. The boy laughed, tugged, pointed at an ice cream shop. My chest caved in. That could have been me and Matthew, me and Rebecca, if not for those bars, those lies, those lost decades. The light turned green, the car moved, and the boy disappeared behind us. My hand gripped the seat so tight my knuckles cracked. Freedom was here, yes, but already I felt its shadow whispering, "You don't belong anymore." I used to dream that freedom would roar in like a storm, bright, deafening, unstoppable. Instead it crept in like fog, quiet, heavy, curling around me until I could barely breathe. I had walked out of prison, but the prison had not walked out of me. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie in the bed of a small apartment the Innocence Project had arranged, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to its whir, waiting for the clang of bars or the guards' barked orders. My body twitched at every car horn, every slam of a door. I still woke at 5 a.m. sharp, expecting count. Freedom didn't erase routine, it carved it deeper, making me a stranger even to myself. I thought I would fill the days with family, with laughter, with warmth. But the faces of my children were distant, cautious, their lives too full of years I had never shared. Linda avoided long conversations, her eyes carrying guilt and something worse, acceptance. And me? I sat alone with a television I didn't understand, phones that glowed like alien suns, a world that had sprinted ahead while I had stood still. People called me exonerated. Reporters snapped photos, asked for quotes. "What will you do now, Mr. Miller?" they asked, shoving microphones toward my face. I gave them polite answers. Maybe write a book, maybe speak about injustice. But inside I had nothing. What book do you write when your story is only pain? What speeches do you give when your voice is cracked, from screaming into walls for decades? At grocery stores, I wandered aisles staring at foods I didn't recognize, prices that made no sense. I fumbled with cash machines, felt stares when I moved too slowly. I tried once to call Rebecca, just to hear her voice without the distance of a table. She answered, her tone clipped. "Dad, I'm busy. I'll call you later." Later never came. Matthew was kinder, offering small visits, polite dinners, but always with his wife watching carefully as though I might shatter their order just by breathing. My grandson looked at me curiously but didn't call me Grandpa. I wasn't part of their story, not really. I was the ghost who'd walked out of a grave they had already dug. So I sit now on a bench in the park, autumn leaves curling at my feet. The air smells of wood smoke. Children's laughter rises from the swings, and the world moves on as if 32 years were just a blink. I am free, yes, but freedom is not the gift I imagined. It is a mirror reflecting all that was stolen and cannot be returned. My mother's funeral I never attended. My children's first dances, graduations, weddings I never saw. A lifetime with Linda that dissolved into silence. These losses do not vanish with a gavel or a key. They echo in every quiet night, in every look of distance in the eyes of those I love. Yet even with the hollow weight in my chest, I keep walking. Because my story is not only mine, it belongs to every voice drowned by injustice, every man or woman buried alive by lies. If I can carry this pain and speak it, maybe it will mean something. Maybe it will stop another father, another mother from vanishing into the cracks of a broken system. And so I end my story not with joy but with truth. I am free, but I am not whole, and I never will be.